How do you feel when you see these buildings? Are you visualizing a luxurious vacation in a five-star hotel? Or imagining how fresh the air is near the green space outside your home? Or rather, did you focus on how run down this apartment looks? How cramped and seemingly unlivable these places would be for you? Although these are just pictures, you can still get an emotional reaction to them, depending on how they look. But what happens then if this was the view for the rest of your life? Many of us human beings rely on sight for daily life. We use it to drive, to work, and to connect with others. Sight is an important tool for understanding the world and how we should feel in the moment. It goads us into generating strong emotions, like jumping out of our seats in fear because of a horror movie, or making us feel sick when we see mold and dirt stains. These one-off encounters can motivate you to act, making you more inclined to get a mop and clean up whatever mold or dirt you see. However, if we experience these same negative events over and over again, the resulting stress can gradually chip us down, deteriorating our well-being. The idea of chronic psychosocial stress captures this idea vividly. For example, let's say you forgot to set up your best friend's birthday party. It starts in an hour and you haven't even gotten a cake. If you're a good friend, you would rightfully feel stressed. At this moment, the body releases molecules like the stress hormone, cortisol. Cortisol is responsible for increasing our heart rate and blood pressure, as well as increasing our blood sugar, providing us with more energy to set up decorations, clean dishes, and even bake a cake right in time for your friend. Although it's not a matter of life or death, your social obligation to your friend convinces your brain that there is an obstacle in the way. The brain then responds by signaling the rest of your body to mobilize its resources and get you to the top of your game. The problem here, though, is that the body cannot keep up this same energy state over a long period of time without hurting itself. If we experience stress for a prolonged period, molecules like cortisol can cause a series of health complications. The increase in blood pressure can begin to damage our blood vessels, causing inflammation, hypertension, and possible clotting. The elevation of our blood sugar can contribute to developing type 2 diabetes. Additionally, less noticeable effects come with stress like immunosuppression, where a person going through enduring stress has a weakened immune system, putting them at higher risk for infection, as well as a higher risk for developing an autoimmune disease. Imagine you live in a densely populated city. Across from your home is an old and dilapidated apartment building, condemned months ago by the city for health violations. Although there are plans to demolish it, you haven't seen much progress come from the project, so there it sits, a reminder of your city's inaction. Perhaps you may feel indifferent, ignoring it on your daily commute to work. But if you feel off-put, averse, or any sort of negative way, then you may be feeling a phenomenon of city dwelling. There's much evidence showing that people living in an urban environment are generally prone to more health complications than those in the countryside. A city upbringing has been connected to increased stress levels and a higher risk of developing mental health disorders such as anxiety and schizophrenia. High crime rates are associated with properties that are poorly maintained, ones where broken windows are not fixed, graffiti remains on walls, and lighting is poor. One of the many factors possibly contributing to higher stress levels may come in the form of architecture and urban design. The effects of overcrowding and pollution are part of the conversation of architecture, but here we want to focus solely on the utility and aesthetics of urban buildings. One of the hallmarks of urban development is the repetition of style, for the sake of conserving creative and physical resources. Although streamlining construction can save millions of dollars, the unchanging duplication of a single type of schematic has seen poor reception from the people who live in housing based on that model. Many urban projects based on significant repetition have failed due to the sole focus on efficiency. Active projects fixated on pure replicability are current-day examples for the failure of modern urban housing principles to meet the needs of our citizens. One of the most costly consequences of modern stylistic repetition is that it creates a deficit in the identity of one city. People require change in order to stay adequately content, and the field of architecture should ensure to apply this ideology, both to give a refreshing feeling of novelty and to carve out a sense of identity in one's hometown. The vast majority of American cities nowadays suffers from this lack of distinguishable personality. Without perhaps one or two recognizable landmarks, the average metropolis would look very much the same, a collection of skyscrapers jutting out of a field of boxy offices and twisting transportation infrastructure. A green space or two may give a desperately needed change in scenery, but even these sorts of developments are becoming more or less convergent on a singular, cost-efficient design philosophy, one that is risk-averse and familiar, but one that ultimately makes a supposedly refreshing green space indistinguishable from another one in the next city over. In St. Louis, the war has long been waged between the preservation of crumbling historic landmarks and the expansion of modern cookie-cutter architectural concepts. The prevalence of the Missouri home builder company McBride & Sons in the city and surrounding counties show this fixation on cheap, easily replicable housing. By 2020 estimates, St. Louis is home to about 180,000 housing units. McBride & Sons has built over 40,000 homes in the past 75 years. This means that over 20% of the housing units in St. Louis share the same McBride & Sons ethos. This doesn't include the standardization of apartment and condominium housing. This is not to insult those that live in standardized housing, since a resident can express as much creative liberty and personality inside their home as they desire. But it's an important consideration into why urbanicity has been linked to poor health outcomes. Human beings feel comfortable in this idea of individuality, that we are all special people with special lives. By homogenizing the domestic experience of hundreds of thousands of residents, you can partially extinguish that feeling of individuality. We want people to think of our cities as dynamic, exciting places of opportunity, and not a stagnation point that holds the same encounters day in and day out. Architecture can also negatively impact our psyche through its exclusivity to the general public, providing freedom and flexibility for only a select few citizens. Building practices like this prevent individuals typically of lower social or economic standing from utilizing spaces to their benefit, and is thus called hostile or defensive architecture. For example, New York has been seeing a surge of anti-homeless spikes on benchtops and ledges, which are suggested to maintain order by discouraging unwanted behaviors like sleeping or skateboarding. Although the private owners of these public spaces are within their right to cultivate their property however they want, these measures seem unnecessarily harsh. Their cons outweigh the benefits as they yield disproportionately negative consequences for those of lower social or economic standing, prohibiting their ability to utilize these public spaces when they had no ill intent in the first place. This partly rejects groups like the homeless from engaging with the community in new urban developments, providing another route to ostracizing certain populations. There are valid concerns in ensuring that potential bad actors within the public have fewer opportunities to harm the rest of the community, but it's important to make a distinction between the homeless and skateboarders as opposed to actual criminals. Defensive architecture is present in public areas typically utilized by the upper middle class, including St. Louis's own Cortex Innovation Community, a district in the Midtown area dedicated to technology and biological research. They collaborate with partners across the region, including Washington University in St. Louis. Although Cortex and the surrounding developments have been seen as a boon on the city's economy and tech startup culture, many detractors have found it to be cold and exclusionary, a so-called public space that seeks to accommodate only a certain echelon of privileged individuals. Intentionally or not, the layout and construction of the growing Cortex district follows in other major city steps of anti-homeless architecture. In many regards, the Cortex district is self-defeating in its goal to provide a novel public space that is accessible for all St. Louisans. We'll start with the Cortex 1 building on the corner of Boyle and Forest Park Avenue. The Cortex 1 building is a collaboration between Washington University and the Wexford Science and Technology Company, a development company aimed at revitalizing metropolitan areas by facilitating scientific innovation. As it says on their site, Wexford has 17 innovation systems, developed or in development, that are built on a foundation of research, discovery, entrepreneurial activity, corporate engagement, and community inclusion. The final pledge of community inclusion is the most relevant point for this discussion. Although I can't speak to the efficacy of the community outreach efforts, we can already point to a few structural elements that indicate a desire to discourage certain populations from interacting with the Cortex 1 building. One such is the entrance facing Forest Park Avenue. Although it looks innocuous enough, the spacing and configuration of the entrance effectively filters out individuals not intending to enter the building. For starters, the walkway here is narrow, which is already unfavorable from a pedestrian access perspective. The walkway's short width discourages any form of locomotion that isn't walking, which includes the use of bikes and skateboards. This also includes locomotion by mobility devices like wheelchairs. Using alternate forms of movement can lead to awkward pathing, since cyclists and skateboards would have to step out of the walkway into the greenery to pass by walking pedestrians. Walking pedestrians, in turn, would also have to step onto the greenery to pass mobility device users. A narrow walkway is generally looked down upon, given how easy it is to congest the walkway and prevent efficient traffic, degrading a user's experience. Additionally, the large blocker in front of the entrance is a subtle deterrent from those passing by. Although the building is supposedly hailed as an inclusive building with many public amenities such as a cafe, an open lobby for social interaction, this blocker discourages entry from those without an initial intent to go inside the building. This can be seen as an act of passive security, where a subtle physical barrier is disguised as art or signage to make access into a building more difficult. The logos for Washington University and Stereotaxis, a company designing surgical robotics, flank the sides of the large Cortex headline, impressing upon viewers the reputation and prestige of the building, while disheartening them from entering the building because of the obstacle. Of course, anyone can enter the building out of their own free will, yet the Cortex 1 building uses hidden design cues to try and prompt your brain to avoid the entrance, while also punishing individuals who opt to use devices to move on the walkways rather than just walk. This can form an implicit feeling of rejection for those passing by the building, helping to detach us from the Cortex community and exacerbate such a clique mentality for those within the district and out. Another example of the hostile architecture is in the Cortex Uncommon Commons, which is designated as the most public sanctum of the Cortex district. Home to a beautiful shaded canopy, bright red seating, and frequent event programming, it's been called the soul of the entire district, ensuring to promote that sense of community. Following crime prevention through environmental design principles, it is well lit with very clear sightlines across the property, ensuring a sense of safety and awareness for visitors. It also features wide pedestrian access points, relieving the area from worries of congestion and crowding. So what's the worry here? The problem is with the benches around the area. During the daytime, these benches act as an efficient seating solution for large events. When these community events end, though, people without shelter may be looking for a place to sleep for the night. The stereotypical park bench is an ideal contingency for sleeping given their elevation, preventing people and animals from stepping or attacking the sleeper, while also minimizing puddle formation around them during a storm. These benches typically have a large backing and go about 15 inches deep, giving a moderate amount of room to prevent the sleeper from falling off. The benches in the Uncommon Commons are about 17 inches deep, appreciably bigger than your average bench. However, the Cortex benches have a unique shape. Instead of just being a flat rectangle, the bench starts out as a flat surface for 7 inches, then angles downward slightly for the rest of the 10 inches. For someone who is just sitting, this doesn't matter as much. For someone who is sleeping, though, the angled 10-inch surface is tilted enough to make falling off the bench a likely outcome if your center of mass is right at the vertex of the angle. Thus, a sleeper can only utilize the 7-inch deep flat piece if they wanted to lay on the bench, which effectively forces them to balance on this sliver of a surface. In addition to wearing multiple layers or keeping your belongings attached to your clothes, this makes these Cortex benches nearly impossible to sleep on, with benches in general being an uncomfortable option in the first place. Many anti-homeless benches apply the use of these uneven surfaces to prevent individuals from sleeping and skating on them, and the Cortex benches are no exception. As previously mentioned, park owners and investors of the Cortex community have the right to cultivate their property in accordance with their desires. Safety should be a prime factor in urban planning of any sort. However, it is disheartening to see that the locations we call public spaces are not as accessible as they should be, especially to populations such as the homeless, who are treated equally to criminals and thus neglected during the design process. The unfortunate reality is that many cities bottle up humanity's worst traits into a confined playground for bad ideas and failed ambitions. Bits of our greed and fanatic adherence to efficiency mesh with a prevalent failure to consider the human aspects of urban life, leading to problems such as indifferently standardized architecture dividing us from each other. Appearance is power, and usually comes first over utility in many modern attempts at urban design. However, all is not lost. Exclusionary planning such as in the Cortex district, or frugal attempts at mass housing with McBride & Son homes are all events that can be reversed. Although damage has been done, the worst of our structures can be torn down to make way for better developments. The plot that once held the infamous Pruitt-Igoe projects has been the site of development for the past decade, with new projects underway to provide services to the under-resourced north side of St. Louis. Homer G. Phillips Memorial Hospital is one such development, having state-of-the-art facilities for dialysis, CT scans, X-rays, and MRIs. It proves that we can build over whatever mistakes we made in the past as long as we remember the lessons we learned along the way, rather than let flaws of urban architecture govern us. May we be the ones to build up a future for all of us.